In 2019, South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem vetoed a bill popular in South Dakota to legalize the cultivation of industrial hemp. At the time, she famously said that South Dakota was not ready. But just over 100 years ago, a South Dakota governor would beg Washington and the private sector for help getting an emergency hemp industry started in the state. The story of how hemp went from a commodity to an oddity to a war hero to a menace to children to a war hero again to a menace and finally to the cash crop of the future is next. The Sioux Empire. We live here, but what do we really know about this land we call home? Many of us were born here writing our story. Many are new here, with new parts of the story to tell. And some of us were always here, but their stories, while not always told, have never been forgotten. This is the Sioux Empire Podcast. Stories about the Sioux Empire you've never heard in the Sioux Empire. Although cannabis as a drug and industrial hemp both derive from the species Cannabis sativa and contain the psychoactive component known as THC, they are distinct strains with unique phytochemical compositions and uses. Hemp has lower concentrations of THC and higher concentrations of cannabis oil, or CBD, which decreases or eliminates its psychoactive effects. However, for the purposes of this story, these two plants are often going to seem as though I'm talking about them pretty interchangeably. Part of that is because while I'm calling this the history of hemp, it's more a story of our cultural perceptions of a plant family. And throughout its history, both plants have been tightly associated. Whatever happens to one on the legal and cultural front is usually the fate of the other one. Colonial capitalism and the slave trade are responsible for the introduction of cannabis to the Americas. Once pipe-smoking weed was adopted for cannabis consumption, the recreational use of cannabis became much more popular due to the nearly immediate psychoactive effects produced by inhaling weed. The Spanish, the Portuguese, and the British are responsible for introducing cannabis to the Americas. Portuguese slave traders trafficked in cannabis-using Africans from Angola to Brazil. From there, cannabis use spread among poor laborers in the Amazon. Spanish colonists introduced cannabis to Colombia, Chile, and Mexico. British colonists trafficked Indian slaves to the Caribbean. These slaves used cannabis recreationally and spiritually, and this practice spread to Barbados, Jamaica, and Trinidad. In many cases, the recreational use of cannabis by slaves was often encouraged, as long as the marijuana consumption did not negatively impact their labor. You see, slave owners encouraged the plant's mood-enhancing and tranquilizing effects. In its own way, cannabis became an effective tool for controlling slave labor. While North American Indians were responsible for introducing tobacco to the British, British colonists were the ones who introduced cannabis to North American Indians. Although the British were aware of the psychotropic effects of smoking cannabis, they were far more interested in the economic versatility of industrial hemp. Hemp was such an important part of the British economy that Queen Elizabeth ordered that all landowners with more than 60 acres of land were required to grow hemp or pay a fine. Farmers in the early North American colonies were required to grow hemp, including such notable figures as George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. It's not clear when the native peoples of the region we now call the Dakotas, Minnesota, Iowa, and Nebraska, first started using these plants, but we do know that the plants arrived well ahead of the European pioneers to this area themselves. Widespread use of hemp in fishing nets and other materials is documented, as well as cannabis being used in religious ceremonies and in medicine. In 1905, Albert Regan, a botanist with the University of Kansas conducting a survey of plant life on the Rosebud Reservation, makes notes about the abundant wild hemp growing throughout the reservation. While growing hemp had been common for European farmers in colonial times, by the early 20th century, American hemp production was on the decline. A farmer from Elk Point, South Dakota, named Carl Ringsard, traveled to the Philippines and described the plantations that, combined with fiber production from the Yucatan region of Mexico, had driven down the price of hemp. In his letter to the Madison Daily Leader, published May 8, 1911, he described the situation as, "The only drawback to raising hemp at this time is difficulty in securing labor and the poor market conditions. As a result, the acreage of crop is being reduced and other crops planted in its place. The coconut is fast replacing hemp as the crop of first importance." Stick a pin in his comment about labor difficulty. That'll come up later. Hemp also had a problem as it became associated with a lot more than industrial and household items. On March 1st, 1913, at Pine Ridge, the Indian Bureau published an announcement in a magazine called The Oglala Light. The massive headline read, "Indians must end mescal orgies." In the editorial, the Bureau recommends that Congress put an end to all intoxicants on the Pine Ridge Reservation. It contains an excerpt from their letter to the United States Senate. "The use of certain articles having injurious effects, among which may be mentioned cannabis indica, or Indian hemp, opium, cocaine, or peyote, or the mescal bean, has been growing among the Indians, and it is believed that the legislation should be enacted prohibiting the sale of such articles to the Indians and the introduction of them to Indian country." And with that, cannabis's complex reputation in the Sioux Empire started to develop. It's the first time that a plant that grows wild in South Dakota will be declared an enemy of the state. Are you familiar with twine? If you didn't grow up on a farm, it's that ratty string that you'll see holding together hay bales. It's important to farming for a variety of reasons, and in 1916, it was really vital to gathering up all sorts of different crops. The harvest of many of South Dakota's most important crops depended on binder machines, and these machines tied everything together using said twine. Not having it could make farming impossible and cancel out the labor-saving power of all these recently developed farm machinery. South Dakota farmers have a problem. With a world war destroying Europe, shipping being harassed by submarine warfare, and with deteriorating relations with the U.S. and Mexico, the Yucatan supply of fiber for twine was failing. There was now a market domestically in the U.S. for hemp again, but there were problems. First, there wasn't enough hemp in the U.S. to meet demand, and it would take time to grow a supply. Second, remember that intensive labor problem we talked about in the Philippines back in 1911? Part of why we haven't seen more hemp production in the U.S. is it's massively labor-intensive, because the effective machines for processing hemp don't exist yet. There is no cotton gin of hemp yet. At virtually all stages of growing and processing in the U.S., they're still going to rely heavily on hand labor. The most basic breakthroughs in machine processing of hemp won't actually occur until 1919. International Harvester sees an opportunity. While they're working to develop that said equipment, they start seeding and subsidizing test plots all over the U.S. to see where they can grow hemp the most effectively. To be clear, this isn't altruism. For while International Harvester had a monopoly on the supply of twine and twine materials in the U.S. for a long time, the complex situations in Africa and Mexico are starting to erode that monopoly right as the experiments begin. Their first test plot in South Dakota was planted in Groton in 1916. In August of that year, the Pure Weekly Free Press estimates that a Groton plot will return around $130 to $150 per acre. That's about $2,600 to $3,000 in June 2020 dollars. A staggering amount considering International Harvester was providing most of the input cost minus labor. With that kind of money on the table, farmers started to take an interest. So it's January 2nd, 1917, and Governor Peter Norbeck of South Dakota is giving his inauguration speech. He thinks he has a solution to the labor problem, and he proposes that research be done on having inmates in Sioux Falls be immediately put to work processing hemp to combat the twine shortage. Unfortunately for South Dakota farmers, they are going to wish that someone had proposed that a lot sooner. In early April 1917, with the toll from sunken U.S. merchant ships and civilian casualties rising, Wilson asks Congress for a war to end all wars that would make the world safe again for democracy. And so, on April 6th, Congress thus voted to declare war on Germany.
Hear them calling you and me, every son of liberty. Hurry right away, no delay, go today. Make your daddy glad to have had such a lad. Tell your sweetheart not to pine, to be proud her boys in line. Over there, over there.
News in March of that year is grim, and officials are already warning the state's farmers that there will be a terrible twine shortage. In 1917, almost every South Dakota farmer needs a lot of twine, and almost everything in farming back then requires it. Figures from the time said the state would need 16 million pounds of twine to make it through the year. But the state prisoner plant would only, best case scenario, be able to produce 3 million pounds. And even worse, a large chunk of the material that they'd ordered this year to create their twine hadn't shown up. There was a lot of speculation in some of the newspapers that elevators and large operators had secured a sweetheart deal with the state, and that the shortage only applied to the little farmers. Officials in charge of the prison twine program even banned the selling of twine by boxcar because of the perception it was creating that there was plenty for those who were rich enough to buy it in bulk. That same month, International Harvester began to escalate their timetable, and more plots were planned for 1917. They bought 9 train car loads of extra hemp and seed, and some of that seed was sent to Vermilion, where the company offers generous terms to farmers in the area to try growing hemp. They offer to rent the land, they offer to share crop, and they guarantee the purchase of any hemp grown. Experts on the plants are hired and sent from Kentucky to instruct Vermilion farmers on the best techniques to grow the hemp. International also expands its hemp experiments in Brown County. A seeding expert is brought in from Grand Forks, and he supervises the planting. By the time planting began, there were also more international plots in Ipswich and all around the northeast of South Dakota. This is good news for the future, but crops take time to be grown. And in the meantime, South Dakota's farmers suffer, but it's just one additional hardship in the sea of challenges that come as America mobilizes for war. Some good news comes in August when the hemp crop in Ipswich is a massive success. Like the Groton plot, the profits are extremely rewarding to the farmers. The politics of the twine shortage are complex, but just know for our story that it's become really hard to get what they used to make twine out of at the prison plant. In November, W.H. King, a Mitchell resident who is secretary of the Board of Charities and Corrections and is one of the main figures behind the state penitentiary's hemp processing plant, travels to New York. He's on a goodwill tour for the state of South Dakota. He visits a camp where units composed of men from his own hometown of Mitchell are waiting for their turn for a ship to take them to the fighting in Europe. He has Thanksgiving dinner with the troops and their commander in the camp. Over dinner, the commander shares some scuttlebutt, implying that some of the men from South Dakota are already on ships halfway across the Atlantic. King later relayed this information to newspaper readers back in Mitchell, but he himself is not headed back just yet. He takes a detour to Washington, D.C., possibly on behalf of the governor, to lobby officials there to help South Dakota find more twine and more hemp. Over the course of the next year, local hemp production in South Dakota will expand, and the prison hemp processing plant will start getting more supply. With future prospects for the crops growing in the state, George L. Kemper creates what might be the state's first private hemp mill. It's located 9 miles east of Aberdeen, and in July of 1918, he brings it online. The process is still very labor-intensive, and it requires 9 men at a time to operate. While the Great War ended in November of that year, the price of hemp continued to run high, and many South Dakota farmers kept some of the crop in rotation, especially because the plant's ability to choke out weeds. International Harvester was also still convinced that hemp was a viable cash product and continued to subsidize test plots and the program in South Dakota. They renewed the program again in 1919. In May of 1922, the price of hemp was still high, and the first known test plots in Sully County are planted just outside Agar. For this next part of our story, we're going to need to take a slight detour into the world of beets, specifically sugar beets. You see, in 1904, Belle Fourche's founder and chief booster, Seth Bullock, yes, the guy from Deadwood, boasted that a sugar beet factory would be very successful there and was feasible. It's better to process the beets closer to where they're grown, and the soil in the area was perfect for them. And on October 15th, 1927, the community finally got their sugar beet plant. The whole thing is a great story, and it was one of the many times in researching this that I wanted to go into a huge tangent. SDPB has a huge article all about the beet plant and its history. It's pretty cool. Anyway, this becomes relevant to our story due to the one thing that beets and hemp have in common. They are very labor-intensive. With the region not having the free inmate supply that the state used for hemp, they imported a lot cheaper immigrant labor to help. Many of these immigrants were from Mexico, and they brought with them a culture that was much more familiar and much less taboo about hemp's cousin, cannabis. Now, to anyone familiar with American history and immigrant stories, this next part is probably not going to come as a huge shock. Many locals feared these different outsiders moving into the area, and one of the things that made them, different was, quote, their funny cigarettes that they smoked. Fear of the other, ethnic tensions, and economic pressure as the 20s moved into the 30s would prime the public for a good old-fashioned moral panic. And the newspapers of the time were happy to sell it to them via high-profile crime stories. And of course, the salacious murders didn't help. An Argus Leader headline from June 26, 1930 reads, "Lopez given life for knife murder." The subline reads, "Mexican laughs as sentences passed for slaying of highway employee." On June 16th, Jose Lopez he'd gotten into a fight with a bunch of the other beet workers, and he tried to flee by stealing a car. The car belonged to a state highway department worker who was nearby, who tried to stop him, and the worker's name was named W.E. Lewis, and his body was found on the main highway several miles east of Newell. Now, this was a big shock to the community and became a very high-profile case. When Lopez was captured, his only alibi that he gave authorities was that he'd been smoking marijuana at the time. The crime was shocking, and not just for its violence and seeming meaninglessness in the face of Lopez's defiant attitude, but W.E. Lewis wasn't just any highway worker either. His son was the state's insurance commissioner, Don C. Lewis, a popular public figure of prominence in the state. A South Dakota media frenzy ensued, and public officials soon were calling for action. On June 17th, State Sheriff Fed Minor called on lawmakers to take action. He told an Associated Press reporter that 5 murders in the last 3 years were traceable directly to the use of this drug, which is said to afflict addicts with fanciful wrongs and exaggerated ideas of their own power. He went on to cite the murder of W.E. Lewis directly in his appeal for legislation. During the 1931 legislative session, authorities acted to draft a new law banning the possession of marijuana. While the legislature debated, newspapers continued to run stories about beet farming Mexicans causing trouble. These stories really stood out to me as they almost all immediately start by identifying the suspect as a Mexican, and then sometimes use less politically correct language than we would today. I apologize for sensitive listeners as I read this passage from the Lead Daily Call from March 31st of 1931. Last night, Officer Costello picked up Manuel Codeo, 35-year-old Mexican. It names him as an accomplice to another Mexican's misdeeds before continuing. Codeo is the same high-jumping Mex the officer picked up several years ago when he ran amok at the CB&Q bunkhouses on Upper Charles Street and chased a bunch of his own countrymen around the neighborhood with a handful of knives. On that occasion, Manuel was charged up on marijuana. He refused to put on his clothes and entirely naked insisted on frolicking in the snow all the way to the police station. Needless to say, the ban passed and took effect on July 1st, 1931. But even with the bans in effect, the stories continued to fill South Dakota newspapers. Marijuana starts being associated with non-Mexican criminals as well. In a high-profile case in November, James Lawton, career criminal with an already very long rap sheet, is sentenced to life for killing a popular former sheriff. In an exhaustive profile of James Lawton that takes up 2 pages of the newspaper, it is mentioned that he is, quote, a marijuana addict. It is a high-profile case, and the Deadwood Daily Pioneer Times on November 3rd quotes police as calling it the most involved case in the annals of Rapid City crime. The 1930s were tough on South Dakota farmers. The drought, the grasshoppers, and the general financial hardship devastated many farms in the Sioux Empire, and many farms went under. Among the natural enemies farmers in South Dakota faced was the infamous creeping Jenny. This vine was and still is a terrible weed for farmers to face. As a kid who had to pull it off of a cultivator as a teenager on a regular basis, I will tell you it sucks. In the summer of 1934, an 80-year-old eccentric pioneer thought he had a solution. At his farm in Rock County, Minnesota, just 2 miles northeast of Valley Springs, W. Bell planted hemp not just as a commodity, but as a weapon against the aggressive creeping Jenny infestation on his farm. Unlike alfalfa and other plants used for similar purposes against creeping Jenny, hemp grows thick enough that it can choke out the vine, he claims. In their second story about Bell that summer, the Argus Leader reported, Mr. Bell has been besieged by inquiries after his experiments since publication of a short news item in the Argus Leader about 10 days ago, indicating that farmers are vitally interested in the control of bothersome weeds, which quickly spread and cause them heavy losses. Bell let his hemp go to seed, and in December he sold the seed to others needing to fight creeping Jenny. It was a promising business model, but Bell would be hemp's last great advocate in the area for quite some time. While Bell was fighting weeds, the federal government was fighting weed with a national push to get states to crack down on cannabis. South Dakota obliges this push, and the legislature passes the Uniform Narcotics Act of 1935. In February of 1937, a combined force of state, county, and city police in Sioux Falls launched a massive raid on 2 gambling houses and a hotel. 13 people were arrested, both for selling gambling equipment and, for the first time ever in South Dakota under this law, arrested for selling marijuana. This was followed up by the next big raid that was made by state police in May, who broke up a racket of 4 Mexicans selling reefers in Belle Fourche. And now we have to zoom out in our story to the national level for a moment. The Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 passed on the 2nd of August. The act was originally passed to increase taxes on the use of hemp. The act didn't technically criminalize the use or possession of marijuana, however, it included a penalty and subjected marijuana possession to some regulations. Farmers had to acquire a tax stamp for the production of hemp fiber. While not making fiber hemp illegal, it made growing it prohibitively expensive, effectively killing the industry in its tracks. The federal government had officially began to blur the lines between fiber hemp and marijuana. In September, the State Secretary of Agriculture, Gordon Stout, ordered that his inspectors start watching for wild marijuana weed growing in the state so that farmers could be ordered to kill the plant. In December of that year, a man named James Jenkins was arrested in Sturgis simply for marijuana possession. As far as I can tell, he's the first black man arrested solely for marijuana possession in South Dakota history. In 1938, the war on the public perception of hemp began in earnest with the full force of both the federal and state governments. March PTA meetings across the state were treated to a presentation called The Marijuana Problem. The Washington High School PTA in Sioux Falls even receives a special early screening of the film Assassin of Youth.
Marijuana dates back as far as 1090 AD. A weed was then called by the Arabic word hashishan, from which we get our English word assassin. During this period, a diabolical, fanatical, cruel, and murderous group living in Syria and Persia committed secret murders in blind obedience to the will of their masters. The heinousness of these crimes aroused all of Europe and Asia. It was their custom that whenever a sheikh required the services of an assassin, a distinctive class known as fejats were intoxicated with hashish, known to us as marijuana. The weed now, as well as then, is rightly accused of exciting the basest and most criminal tendencies in the minds of its addicts.
Assassin of Youth is a 1937 exploitation film by Elmer Clifton. It's a film that's supposed to be about the ill effects of cannabis, and the film is often considered to be a clone of the much more famous and popular Reefer Madness, sharing a cast member in Dorothy Short. The thriller reflects perfectly the anti-drug propaganda of its time. Young marijuana gangs, late-night drug parties where anything can happen, and moral comeuppance are the order of the day in this surprisingly boring film. I wouldn't recommend it. If you're like me and you watch old movies from that era to riff on them, Assassin of Youth is it's the version of Reefer Madness that you ordered from Wish. The filmmakers behind Assassin of Youth are eager to ride the wave of fear spreading across America and capitalize on the publicity by doing promotional showings. In fact, as a further publicity stunt for the film's official premiere in Sioux Falls, the Granada Theater placed an ad in the Argus Leader on July 1st offering a $100 cash reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of anyone selling marijuana in Minnehaha County. That summer, marijuana would be attacked from the pulpits of South Dakota. A Seventh-day Adventist in Huron, Mrs. Grace Stewart, delivers a fiery presentation to the Parents' Home Commission entitled Drugs and Young America. Here's an excerpt from her speech. Our own state, South Dakota, has not escaped. Several arrests of peddlers have been made in the Black Hills, in the beet-field regions. It was brought in, no doubt, by those Mexican laborers. On a personal side note, I can't help but pause and consider how modern this sounds, with drugs being tied to immigration and racial overtones. Anyway, she continues. Marijuana is the unknown quantity of drugs. Not one knows when he smokes the reefer whether he will be a mad reveler, a musician producing hot tunes with incredible skill, a philosopher, or a murderer. At this time, it was common to associate marijuana with jazz music, and specifically the African-American musicians who created it. So this is a racial subtext that wouldn't be lost on the audience of its time. By December, the tide of public opinion had turned, and a new history of hemp was being written in South Dakota's collective memory. The Argus Leader's Questions column, which had just 3 years ago celebrated W. W. Bell's use of hemp to combat Creeping Jenny, was asked about it and such use, and replied, Several years ago, a few seed dealers sold hemp seed for the purposes of choking out noxious weeds. It's practically worthless for this, but some of the plants still exist. And that's the way it carried on for some time. Newspapers began to run little propaganda PSAs like this gem from the Lead Daily Caller, April 20th, 1939. The natives of Malay Peninsula, while under marijuana's effects, have been known to engage in violent and bloody deeds. With complete disregard for personal safety, the drug is considered more dangerous than cocaine or opium, neither of which grow in this country. A pastor in Sioux Falls told the Hawthorne PTA members that year, Marijuana is the Indian hemp plant introduced to this country by way of Mexico and is one of the most dangerous narcotics because it produces illusions of both time and space. Yeah, I can't help myself on that one. I really start thinking about Doctor Who. I don't have the rights to it, but insert the Doctor Who theme right there. And of course, our favorite movie, The Assassin of Youth, was so popular that it returned to Sioux Falls for a return engagement in theaters. With such a pervasive campaign of anti-weed propaganda being put out by federal and state government, you would think this is where the story ends at this point. But while America worries about the morality of their youth and Mexicans with funny cigarettes, a real threat is rising in the East and will upend every aspect of American life. In 1941, all the pieces start moving in place for a twine shortage on the scale not seen since 1917. Financial and regulatory trouble began to plague the state's penitentiary twine factory. You see, other ag states in the region had developed their own twine plants to meet the crisis back in the day, and just before 1941, they had started to flood the market with cheap twine. South Dakota's prison-made twine had developed a very bad reputation as a sabotage campaign carried out by prisoners between 1919 and 1921 had made many producers in South Dakota not trust the prison-made twine from South Dakota, and were constantly urging civic pride and that South Dakotans needed to buy South Dakota twine and that buying out of state was unpatriotic. However, by 1941, many South Dakota producers were buying twine from the Minnesota prison system, while South Dakota twine was gathering dust in warehouses. In January, South Dakota started backing a move at the federal level to ban the shipping of prison twine between states to force South Dakota's farmers to buy in-state prison twine. Planners in Washington knew that a war was coming and that access to fiber for twine would be a very easy target for the Japanese. As attitudes eased, a farm column, Farm Observations, in the Argus Leader on June 19, 1941, actually recognizes the work of W. W. Bell again. Bell belongs to that class of farmers who are a big benefit to any section. His early pioneering in farming in South Dakota was in connection with alfalfa growing, and Mr. Bell, at about the same time as Seth Bullock of Belle Fourche, was experimenting with alfalfa, the one in the Black Hills and the other in Valley Springs, helped to get the splendid foliage well established in Sioux Falls territory. During recent years, Mr. Bell has been experimenting with hemp for the purposes of swamping out Creeping Jenny. But federal authorities criticize this idea on the ground that hemp is too closely related to the weed drug marijuana. And while hemp seems to get the best of Creeping Jenny, it's a dangerous proposition in and of itself. So for those of you keeping score at home, Bell has gone from genius visionary who defeated Creeping Jenny with hemp to nameless, unscrupulous seed dealer whose hemp is dangerous and is useless to kill Creeping Jenny to pioneer who did come up with a way that works of killing Creeping Jenny in the span of 7 years. In April of 1941, an agronomist tracking commodity supplies notes in a single line in his report, published to papers across the country, that the Japanese in the Philippines now control more than half of the island's output of hemp.
On December 7th, 1941, Japan, like its infamous Axis partners, struck first and declared war afterwards. Costly to our Navy was the loss of war vessels, airplanes, and equipment, but more costly to Japan was the effectiveness of its foul attack in immediately unifying America in its determination to fight and win the war thrust upon it, and to win the peace that will follow.
Then came the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in late 1941, followed by the Japanese invasion of the Philippines in January of 1942. In the Atlantic, prowling German submarines stemmed the flow of goods from the Mediterranean and the Caribbean. Committed to a war that required a well-outfitted navy, the United States and its allies now had to reconsider their source of nautical rope and rigging. Just days after Manila fell to the Japanese, the U.S., Great Britain, and Canada formed the Raw Material Purchase Board to buy raw materials and arms production, as well as seek alternative sources of rubber, tin, tungsten, hemp, and other vital supplies. On January 7, 1942, not even a week after their source of Manila hemp had been compromised, the USDA announced plans to plant 30,000 acres of hemp in Kentucky and Tennessee. These fields would produce the seed that would be used by the rest of the nation to grow hemp.
In those days, hemp was an important crop in Kentucky and Missouri. Then came cheaper imported fibers for cordage, like jute, sisal, and Manila hemp, and the culture of hemp in America declined. But now, with Philippine and East Indian sources of hemp in the hands of the Japanese, and shipment of jute from India curtailed, American hemp must meet the needs of our Army and Navy, as well as of our industries. This film is designed to tell farmers how to handle this ancient crop, now little known outside Kentucky and Wisconsin.
Some farmers in the Sioux Falls area were eager to help the cause, citing patriotism, high profits to be made, and of course, W. W. Bell's success in killing Creeping Jenny. One farmer wrote to the Argus Leader in November of 1942 that if enough farmers in the area agree to grow the crop, Sioux Falls may be able to attract one of the hundreds of federal hemp mills the USDA building across the country. But it was not to be. While hemp would be grown in the area, almost all of the lucrative government hemp mills would be built across the border in Minnesota. The nearest one to Sioux Falls would be built in Jackson, Minnesota. The distance from many hemp mills meant that while farms in South Dakota would grow hemp, it would not be in the vast quantities seen in states that received federal mills like Iowa and Minnesota. The England and Stavin Company of Watertown, South Dakota would be hired by the Commodity Credit Company. This is basically the corporate front for the USDA during the war, to build a hemp mill in Montgomery, Minnesota at a cost of $118,000, or $1.7 million in June 2020 money. In September, the State Department of Agriculture reported that they had successfully grown a test plot of hemp for the first time in Flandreau, South Dakota. Stick a pin in that, Flandreau comes up again later. Individual farmers, especially those who managed to produce high-quality fiber, saw exceptional profit ranged from about $50 upwards of $200 per acre, a price fetched by few other agricultural commodities at the time. For farmers like my dad who are curious, that would be the equivalent today of a crop that brought in $750 to $3,000 per acre in June of 2020 money. Overall, in just two crops, 1943 and 1944, the nation had Overall, in just 2 crops in 1943 and 1944, the nation had harvested approximately 186,000 acres of hemp, providing more than enough raw material for the military's needs. In fact, the government had so much surplus hemp after this that in 1943, they had the American cord manufacturers absorb a portion of the domestic supply. By the winter of 1943, Midwest hemp farmers were busy delivering their final bushels of hemp to the local mills. Marveling at their new profitable industry, they were anxious to plant more acreage the next year. But by January of 1944, Allied forces had eliminated the German submarine threat in the Atlantic. With jute and other foreign fibers coming in again from the Mediterranean and the Caribbean, the government greatly reduced the domestic hemp industry in 1944. The Rapid City Journal announced that month that of the 42 Midwest hemp mills in operation or under construction, 28 would be shuttered and the program acreage would be reduced by about 60%. The abrupt downsizing of the domestic hemp industry apparently took Midwestern farmers by surprise, and many reacted angrily. After all, they'd spent the last year learning about all they could about hemp, not to mention performing intense labor of cultivating, harvesting, and processing it. They were well paid for that work, and with a season under their belts, they simply weren't ready to give it up yet. The hearings and investigations into wartime domestic hemp program are definitely their own story that I can't do justice to in this episode. But if you wanted to learn more about the states that were really heavily affected by this because they had all the mills and all the infrastructure, you should check out the blog Hempirical Evidence. That's spelled Hempirical, Hempirical Evidence, which does an outstanding job of documenting the story of this particular battle and of the other states' perspective, and gives you a little bit more of the national perspective on this whole program. By February of 1945, the Argus Leader would report that the Jackson facility that had cost taxpayers around $350,000 to build was now sitting empty. When it was operating, it had paid out more than $185,000 to area farmers and had a payroll of $122,000. So, adjusted for inflation, the farmer payout was $2.6 million, and the payroll was $1.7 million. And with the closing of those final mills, a hemp dark age began in the region. Stories about that time farmers everywhere grew hemp on purpose would be told by farmers and their sons. A few photos would be shown to children and grandchildren. The hemp fields of South Dakota would become another one of those old-timer stories that retired farmers in small towns would tell as they gathered in small-town cafes for coffee and games of cards and dominoes. Time would march on. America would change, and with it, South Dakota. During the 1950s and 60s, marijuana use among the growing youth culture and other social movements became a symbol of rebellion against authority. By the late 1960s, a cultural backlash against these movements arose in U.S. politics in the form of Richard M. Nixon's election to president in 1968. Nixon had run on, among other things, a law and order platform, and once elected, that's what he pursued.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to summarize for you the meeting that I have just had with the bipartisan leaders, which began at 8 o'clock and was completed 2 hours later. I began the meeting by making this statement, which I think needs to be made to the nation. America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
As part of the war on drugs, the Controlled Substances Act of 1970 was signed into law by Richard Nixon. This repealed the Marijuana Tax Act and listed marijuana as a Schedule I drug, along with heroin, LSD, and ecstasy, with no medical uses and a high potential for abuse. It was identified in anti-drug programs like DARE as a gateway drug. At the state level, the South Dakota State Legislature would pass a bill that same year giving the State Weed Commission authority to eradicate, quote, socially dangerous weeds. In 1972, a report from the National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse, also known as the Schaefer Commission, released a report titled Marijuana, A Signal of Misunderstanding. This report recommended partial prohibition and lower penalties for possession of small amounts of marijuana. Nixon and other government officials, however, ignored the report's findings. Yeah, In 2016, the public would learn why these findings had been ignored. John Ehrlichman, who served as the president's domestic policy chief, gained new notoriety after appearing in a cover story in Harper's Magazine by author Dan Baum. Ehrlichman, who died in 1999, said, referring to Nixon's declaration of war on drugs, and this is a quote here, "You want to know what it was really all about? The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either of those things, to be against the war or black. But by getting the public to associate hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders. We could raid their homes. We could break up their meetings. We could vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about drugs? Of course we did." In 1975, Davidson County Sheriff Lyle Swenson will claim that the real reason they try so hard to control wild hemp in South Dakota is the danger it possesses to marijuana smokers, claiming that the stuff is easy for them to get, so they go out and pick it and they think that it's marijuana. In 1972, some Nebraska youths were discovered harvesting what looked like marijuana, but it actually turned out to be poisonous hemlock. By that time, hemp's legacy in South Dakota had been partially forgotten and distorted. In that same article from September 8, 1975, from the Daily Republic, staff writer Mary Lynn Locken will claim, "During World War II, farmers were paid to grow wild hemp for rope, but the finished product was of such poor quality that the plant was rejected. In 1976, the legislature passed a law to make small amounts of marijuana a petty offense, punishable by a fine of just $20. But before that could go into effect, in 1977, they reversed themselves and moved marijuana back up to a misdemeanor at the state level. At the time, Roger Merriman of the Health Department's Division on Drugs and Substance Control lamented, "I thought maybe we'd reached a point where we could concentrate on more serious drug problems, but we have a conservative legislature, and that's where we're at." Then, in 1977, a certain figure of note in South Dakota history weighed in on the issue of marijuana, someone with an ego big enough that he didn't really care how the legislature felt about the issue. Enter Attorney General William Janklow, 1 year away from being elected governor for the first time. He tells the Associated Press reporter Phyllis Mensing, "Chemical drugs are really what I'm after, frankly. I know those hurt people. Marijuana, there's conflicting reports on that." He continues in the interview, "We emphasize chemicals. That's the only straight way I can answer it. We start with opiates and heroin, and we work our way down." Kevin Wooster of the Argus Leader writes, on June 17, 1996, the headline, "Pot Squad Uses Weak Spray to Make a Dent in Area Hemp Crop." The story is a profile of David Myers, a state employee described by the piece as the county's one-man search and destroy squad for state and federal campaign to poison wild hemp, which can be harvested and made into marijuana. To do his job, the federal government says Myers must take a deputy along. The badge and the handgun could be valuable if someone happened to be tending the wild hemp when Myers arrived. That hasn't happened yet. The native tribes of South Dakota were the first to grow and utilize hemp in the territory, and it would be they who spearheaded the fight to bring hemp back from exile. "2000 didn't start off as a great year for hemp in South Dakota. The winter legislative session bill to create some experimental plots of hemp in South Dakota was killed 10-2 in a House Agricultural Committee hearing. But that spring, the Oglala Nation votes to approve the planting of hemp on their reservation, a move that will technically fall into the legal gray area as tribes claim sovereignty over their lands, while the federal government claims the right to enforce certain federal laws on the reservations via the Major Crimes Act. Tribes, however, have never surrendered jurisdiction. Growing the tribe's first patch was Alex Whiteplume. Whiteplume was the organizer of the Bigfoot Memorial Ride and the former director of the tribe's Fish and Game Department, and was an outspoken advocate for personal and tribal sovereignty. Whiteplume's crop prospered over the summer, and the harvest ceremony was planned, but federal law enforcement were making their own plans. And on August 24th, armed men with multiple law enforcement agencies converged on Whiteplume's farm by land and with 2 airplanes and a helicopter. 25 agents armed with rifles and wearing bulletproof vests in a scene that wouldn't have looked out of place at Waco or Ruby Ridge, or sadly the pipeline protests of 2016 and 2017, proceeded to serve Whiteplume a search warrant. They then held him and his family at gunpoint, and the family watched as federal agents destroyed the hemp crop.
When I arrived down there, I was trying to get by that roadblock because this is my land, and then I heard these sounds of chainsaws going. So I tried to drive around them, and the U.S. Marshal pointed his gun right at my forehead and said, "You halt, halt, halt." So that scared the living daylights out of me, so I just pulled over, and my little brother was also trying to get over to put a stop to this because we already had a buyer for this hemp stocks here in the United States, and we didn't want them taking it from us, so we made every effort to get them to stop. We said, "Can you stop? Let us call Ted McBride. We're going to get our lawyer. Let's stop this. We have a restraining order," on and on. But they said, "No, we have a search warrant, and we're going to process it." And so they did, and finally I couldn't see the destruction of the hemp anymore. It was just hurting me because weekend before we went up to Eagle Butte during our Sundance ritual. We go up to Cherry Creek, and we designed a little... because we have a kill ceremony. Before you could kill a tree or kill an animal, Lakotas, we have a kill ceremony to release their spirit prior to taking their life, and we let them know why we're doing that. So we created a real beautiful little ceremony for the hemp field, and we were getting ready to do that today. Today was Tuesday, well, yesterday, Monday. And hell, we weren't even allowed to do that, so we were just kind of saddened by that. We were trying to exercise our culture a little bit, and culture is not just singing and dancing and language. It's above and beyond that. It's the way you are as a person, the way you think in Lakota. And these are some of the rituals that we need to always stand by. And every day we need to think in Lakota, and this is all we were doing. But one of my sisters was sitting down there after they came and left and took everything, and she was sitting down there.
Alex?
Yeah.
Okay. You still there?
Yeah, I'm still here.
In August of 2002, he was served 8 civil charges by the U.S. District Attorney related to the hemp cultivation, and a court order prohibited the continued growing of the crop. Whiteplume went on to be elected vice president of the Oglala Sioux tribe in November of 2004, until June 29, 2006, after the tribal council impeached and removed the former president from office. He served as president until the next election in November of 2006. Time went on, and legalization was becoming a viable movement, both for hemp and cannabis. The biggest breakthrough nationally would come on November 6, 2012, when Colorado voters would vote to legalize recreational marijuana. Colorado Amendment 64 led to the legalization in January of 2014. In 2015, the Justice Department outlined a new policy that allows Indian tribes to grow and sell marijuana under the same conditions as some states, and the Santee Sioux moved to legalize marijuana on their reservation. The tribe had big ambitions. The new venture was a plan to open the nation's first marijuana resort on its reservation to complement the tribe's casino. Santee Sioux leaders planned to grow their own pot and sell it for a smoking lounge that would have included a nightclub, arcade games, bar and food service, and eventually slot machines and an outdoor music venue. The plan did face resistance, however, from the city of Flandreau's leaders. Part of the tribe's reservation that is scattered across Moody County lies within the southwest corner of that city. The city had a falling out with the tribe that ended their shared policing agreement and meant the city had to downsize its police force. After that, the city went quiet on public comment. Not staying quiet, however, was South Dakota Attorney General Marty Jakely. He opposed the resort from the beginning and threatened to raid the grow facility. The tribe ultimately destroyed its own crop in November of 2015 after federal officials signaled a potential raid, but it wasn't enough for Jakely. as he had ambitions of running for governor and wanted to project himself as a law and order candidate. So about 9 months after the tribe destroyed their crop, Jakely announced charges against Eric Hagan and Jonathan Hunt, officials with Monarch America, a Colorado-based company in the marijuana industry. Hagan pled not guilty to charges of conspiracy to possess, possession, and attempted possession of more than 10 pounds of marijuana. Hunt pled guilty to a drug conspiracy count after agreeing to cooperate with law enforcement. While Jakely argued that the state didn't have jurisdiction over the tribe, he argued that state courts have jurisdiction over non-Native Americans who commit victimless crimes in Indian country. Hagan's defense argued that the federal government had jurisdiction. Hagan went to trial, and a jury only took a couple of hours to find him not guilty in state court. He had faced a maximum penalty of 10 years in prison on both the conspiracy and possession counts, and 7.5 years on the attempted possession count. Afterward, he said, "The state didn't have a case. I never once thought I was guilty." The verdict was a setback for attorney Marty Jakely, who at this point had announced his run for governor in 2018. He said in a statement, "I do continue to urge our South Dakota tribes to make their own determination that marijuana grows of this nature can affect public health and safety on the reservations and across our state." In 2018, he would be defeated by U.S. Representative Kristi Noem in the Republican primary for governor. Some of the media at the time pointed to his decision to pursue charges against the marijuana consultants as a factor for his loss. Of the whole Santee Sioux marijuana resort episode, the tribal president said this: "It's unfortunate that we were unable to be successful with the project. We were hoping with the revenues to do a lot of positive things for the tribe and the local community." By 2019, only 3 states allowed no form of hemp farming: Idaho, Mississippi, and South Dakota. The rest of the United States allowed for the cultivation of hemp via commercial, research, or pilot programs. Attempting to catch up with the rest of the country, South Dakota legislature would pass House Bill 1191, creating the framework for industrial hemp growth. The bill has bipartisan support and passes easily. The South Dakota Farmers Union called the industrial hemp bill forward-thinking and urged Noem to sign the bill, saying, "If the governor would sign this bill, it will open the door to processors and allow our family farmers and ranchers to remain competitive with the surrounding states that have passed similar bills." Kristi Noem would veto the bill, saying, "Our state is not yet ready for industrial hemp." Noem seemed to revel in her defiance of what the people and the legislature wanted, even going so far as creating a highly produced video in which she burns the word veto onto the bill with a branding iron. "I am concerned that this bill supports the national effort to legalize marijuana for recreational use," she wrote. "There is no question in my mind that normalizing hemp, like legalizing marijuana, is part of a larger strategy to undermine the enforcement of drug laws and to make legalized marijuana inevitable."
South Dakota is not ready for industrial hemp. Today, I'm vetoing the measure that the House and Senate sent to my desk. Let me tell you why. First, we aren't ready from a law enforcement perspective. Our drug dogs will hit on industrial hemp just like they do on marijuana. They smell the same, they will test the same. Our officers alongside a road will not have the tools they need to be able to tell a crop from a drug. We're just not ready. My decision to veto this bill is not based on speculation. It's based on fact, and South Dakota is not ready for industrial hemp.
While support had been bipartisan, the legislature would come up short on the votes to override the veto. Over the course of 2019, pressure mounts on Noem to support an industrial hemp program. There's one incident in particular that sticks out in my mind and kind of helped inspire me to create this episode. In November of 2019, U.S. Senator and former Governor Mike Rounds, a fellow Republican, shared a photo on Facebook of his dad harvesting hemp in South Dakota, most likely during the 41 through 43 hemp boom that we discussed previously. Rounds referenced the picture during a telephone town hall event where he was asked about the potential for hemp in the textile industry. Rounds said the plant was used to make ropes for the Navy during World War II. Some political observers speculated that the post was a subtle dig at Governor Noem for her 2019 veto and her threats at the time that she would veto any similar bill in 2020. Then, on March 27, 2020, Noem signed House Bill 1008 into law, effective immediately, 103 years after Governor Peter Norbeck had called for using industrial hemp to save the state's farmers from the 1917 twine shortage. Also in March, members of the Oglala Sioux tribe passed a referendum to legalize medical and recreational marijuana on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, with 82% of voters approving the medical marijuana and 74% approving recreational pot. The Oglala Sioux will become the only Native American tribe to set up a cannabis market in a state where it's otherwise illegal. Almost 113 years to the day that the Indian Bureau agents began to take away hemp from the tribe, the Oglala Sioux are taking it back. In November of 2020, South Dakota will be the first state to vote on medical marijuana and recreational marijuana legalization on the same ballot. I have no intention of telling you how you should vote, but now after this program, I hope you feel like you're able to make a more informed decision.
This is Manila hemp from the Navy's rapidly dwindling reserve. When that is gone, American hemp will go on duty again. Hemp for mooring ships, hemp for tow lines, hemp for tackle and gear, hemp for countless naval uses, both on ship and shore. Just as in the days when old Ironside sailed the seas victorious, with her hempen shrouds and hempen sails. Hemp for victory.
So what does everyone think of the new format? Did you love it? Do you hate it? Let me know on Facebook and Twitter. And also, if you really like the new format and you want to help me make more like this, because let's just say this beast was a mountain of work. I loved doing it, but it was a lot of research hours. You can help me get more books and more access to research databases by supporting the show at Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/Sioux Empire Podcast. So once again, I just want to thank everybody for listening. I really hope you enjoyed this history. It was a lot of hard work, but I really enjoyed making it and I learned so much. I've got more comprehensive histories like this planned. So if you want to keep up to date on that, be sure you subscribe. If you loved it, please, that would be awesome if you Spotify or iTunes or wherever you're at, if you'd leave a review for the podcast or just share these posts on social media, that would also be very awesome. I hope you enjoyed this history, and like I said, I plan to do many more of them. So this has been Robert Mailing for the Sioux Empire Podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.